Welcome, everybody. I'm Luke Gbedemah. I'm one of the reporters here at Tortoise. And this is part of a series of ThinkIns where our editors and reporters, we look at a subject that is in the news at the moment and has really made us sort of sit up and think, what's really going on here? And there have been three stories in the past few weeks that, for me, made it very clear that in this ThinkIn, I'd love to talk about consciousness. And it's a tall order because getting to the bottom of consciousness in an hour, ambitious, but there are few better people than Anil, Seth to help us do that. He's a neuroscientist and the author of the brilliant Being You, the new science of consciousness, who's joining us this evening. So welcome to Anil. And I hope that rather than try and answer the question that you, Anil, have called one of the greatest remaining mysteries in science and philosophy before 7:30, we could actually try and answer some of the questions about how society is thinking about consciousness at the moment, how we write about it, how we talk about it, where it is cropping up as an issue, and what it really means for us, but also for the natural world and for the technologies that we build. Because I'd love to try and understand whether we're sort of moving into a time where consciousness is going to be more contested as an idea than it has been before. But I will also say at the top, this is a Tortoise ThinkIn. So please, everyone, do weigh in. We're not going to do a Q&A at the end. The Q&A starts right now. We really want to hear what you think. We want to hear your opinions, your observations, not just around Anil's work, of course, but the broader subjects at hand. I know there are a number of people in the room who have studied animal consciousness, human consciousness, sentience, and also machine learning and thinking machines. So please do just raise your digital hand or put your comments in the chat, where my colleague Phoebe will be looking out for them. But just briefly on those three stories that I mentioned, the three stories that I think really pointed me to this subject today. The first is the case of LaMDA, an AI model which a Google engineer claimed had become sentient, Google being the company that had developed the AI in the first place. A few days later, the case of Happy the elephant, who lost a court battle over legal personhood in the United States, and it was found not to have the right to be freed from confinement in a zoo. And finally, the case of Archie Battersby, who at age 12 experienced brainstem death, but whose parents insist he still has a chance of life, and they believe that he could be restored by a miracle. And that's, of course, complicated discussions about when sort of morally, when legally, and when medically someone is actually dead or alive. So there's a lot to get into. I'm absolutely over the moon to have you joining us, Anil, and it would be great to start with you and with the book. At the very beginning of Being You, you talk about anesthesia. You talk about the experience of leaving consciousness and then returning to it. And that's sort of a real gateway into the rest of the stuff that you discuss in your book, all of the stories and anecdotes, but also all of the research. And I wondered, maybe at the top, could you give us like your working definition of consciousness, and maybe then a sort of précis of what you've started to find in your research?
Absolutely. Thanks, Luke. It's a real pleasure to be here and talk to you about these issues. My working definition of consciousness is stolen straight from the philosopher Thomas Nagel, who said, "For a conscious organism, there is something it is like to be that organism." And that means there's something, what he's trying to get at there is that there is something it feels like to be me. There's something it feels like to be you, anybody who's listening now. There's probably something it feels like to be Happy the elephant, though it may not be, that's distinct from the issue of personhood.
Yeah.
And of course, the Google engineer thinks that there is something it feels like to be that AI system, LaMDA, though hardly anybody else agrees with that. I'm sure we'll get onto that. And things like tables and chairs, well, it doesn't really feel like anything to be a table or a chair. So this is, I think, an important starting point. It's quite general, right? It means that consciousness is not the same thing as being a self or being particularly intelligent or any of the other things that we might associate with it. It's just the raw fact of being the subject of any kind of experience.
Mm. And you write towards the beginning of the book that it seems to have consciousness seems to have more to do with being alive than being intelligent. And I guess on all three of the levels that we've set out at the beginning, the human animal, the non-human animal, and the machine, there are different things going on there with those two, the livingness and the intelligentness. And I wonder, sort of, there was a slide just there, as we showed the intro, that compared the neuronal mass, basically, of a few different species. Elephants and chimps are pretty close to humans.
This is true. I mean, the first thing is in the book, yeah. I mean, I start with this anesthesia example, and I mean, one of the really nice things when you're writing about consciousness is because it's a mystery that's really familiar to each of us, right? It's not like trying to explain quantum mechanics or black holes. We all know what it's like to be conscious, and we all know what it's like to lose it. Even if we don't have general anesthesia, we've all fallen asleep into a dreamless sleep.
Yeah. And
so it's at once the most mysterious and most familiar aspect of our lives. So throughout the book, I try and weave together the things from personal experience, which hopefully others can relate to, and also what's known from the science and philosophy, and then what I personally think. And you're right to say that what I have come to think is that consciousness, and especially the way we experience being a self, that aspect of consciousness that is the experience of being me, is very, very closely tied to our nature as living systems. Now, certainly not everybody agrees with that, but it's the point that I get to. And you're also quite right that the further you remove consciousness from intelligence, which has historically been a very, very intimate association. Sometimes people use the terms almost synonymously or use one to infer the other. That has a lot of implications for what we think about the prevalence of consciousness in the world, in other animals, and in machines and technologies, and for what the positions we might take morally and ethically.
Yeah. So in your understanding, what should we make morally, ethically, and I suppose scientifically of that fact that elephants, chimps, gorillas, other species do have large brains? They have large brains capable of complex function. Because you write in the book, we've typically seen other animals not as things like us, but as, it's a great phrase, flesh automatons without the ability to reflect on their own existence. Is that something that you think we might start to see change around cases like Happy the Elephant and others?
I mean, I think we've seen this position shift so much, and often we tend to hold quite intuitively different views than might be enshrined in legal frameworks. And people with pets are convinced their pets have conscious experiences, and even have a sort of sense of self, right? So intuitively, you might think that idea of other animals being flesh automata, that actually comes back from Descartes, René Descartes, who's responsible for a lot of the confusion about consciousness over the last few hundred years. But Descartes also had a pet dog. He called it Mr. Scratch. So it's unclear actually whether he was being consistent between his writing and his everyday life. Now, there is this interesting fact about brain size. You did mention that, so let's get to that. It is, I mean, some Greek dolphins have larger brains than humans, if I'm remembering right. But what do we make of these things? Well, it gets very complicated. There's a very strong correlation across species between body mass and brain size. Put simply, if you have a bigger body, you need a bigger brain just to keep going. So that in itself may not matter so much. Then people look at things like the ratio of the cortex to other parts of the brain. Maybe that matters, and so on and so on. And there you definitely do see very interesting differences. I mean, chimps are very, very close to us, elephants further away in evolutionary terms. Birds have a lot of neuronal mass for that, what would be expected for their body weight, but then they have to fly. Octopuses have most of their brains in their arms rather than in their heads, but they have also sort of proportionately large brains. It's not in itself a hugely reliable marker of anything. If anything, it can be a marker of cognitive capability, but even then we've got to be very careful about confounding factors. But the key thing here is that cognitive capability, or intelligence in quotes, is not the same thing as consciousness. So what we've tended to do over the years is make an inference about how we should treat other animals, partly on the basis of the signs of intelligence that they show, that if they seem to be more humanly intelligent in human-like ways, then they're more likely to be conscious in human-like ways, and therefore more deserving of ethical and moral treatment, more in line with how we would treat other humans. But of course, all you need in order to be something that we should take a moral and ethical stance towards is something that has the capability of feeling anything, especially of feeling suffering. And that is almost certainly very, very widespread in the animal kingdom.
So there are a couple of things that you do mention, you comment on in the book, and that are really interesting as to whether we should and can see them sort of expressed more widely than in humans. And that's an inner universe, awareness, and by extension, this idea of consciousness. And I think what I have seen when I look at the comparisons that get made in ape studies between, is especially with human children, is that really earlier on in our lives, and sometimes in adulthood, we don't necessarily demonstrate as much of a sense of having an inner universe and awareness, certainly not in a way that is so obviously an order of magnitude greater than apes, gorillas, chimps, bonobos are capable of.
That's right. I mean, one of the main tests that's been debated in the animal cognition literature for ages now is called the mirror test. And this is a very famous test, and it's really a test of whether an animal can recognize that a mirror image of itself is itself. Does it recognize itself in the mirror?
Right.
And we humans, after a certain age, we don't think about it, right? Usually, we look in the mirror, we know it's us, for better or worse. Now, turns out this is very, very unnatural thing for many other creatures to do. Some gorillas can do it, and some chimps can do it. Most monkeys can't do it at all. Dogs and cats can't do it. And then some other discussions, maybe an elephant can do it. Maybe
so I think one of the interesting, I think, as Phoebe's just put in the chat, one of the interesting things about the case of Happy, that was one of the first and only elephants to pass that mirror test you're describing.
Yeah, I think, and you do see these isolated examples, but it's kind of hard to read into an isolated example. You don't quite know how much training there's been. You don't quite know whether it's past. The thing for us is it comes so intuitive. We don't even think about it. It's not there until about 12 to 18 months of age, and then it's there. And I think you made a good point that the fact that human babies fail the mirror test, we don't take as evidence that they're unconscious, right? I mean, of course, we treat them very well. Although it wasn't that long ago that some surgery on human babies didn't use anesthetic because surgeons thought the potential danger of the anesthetic outweighed. They thought they probably didn't really feel pain, which is really surprising looking back. But the fact that I think it does mark an interesting distinction, so that species that regularly pass the mirror test have a natural conception of themselves as distinct from others, and what they might look, and also that they can be seen as an individual by others, which I think is really the key thing. And the fact that that doesn't come naturally to many species is interesting. It means that they don't experience being a self in quite the same way, but they may well still have plenty of other experiences related to selfhood. They probably feel plenty of emotional experiences, fear, anger, and so on. You can have all these things without having to have this high level self-reflective ability that the mirror test picks out. Of course, there also on the other side, there may be many reasons why animals fail the mirror test.
Right.
Animals don't like looking in mirrors. They don't like engaging in eye contact. So gorillas often struggle because making eye contact is a very socially dangerous thing to do. And then for some species like dogs, mirrors aren't that relevant. They care more about what they smell rather than what they see. So there's problems on both sides with how you interpret this data.
Yeah. So the subject of human children and this idea of when consciousness, life, being start and end is really relevant to one of the stories that we mentioned at the top. And I know also that my colleague Phoebe has been looking extensively at start of life interpretations, particularly in the context of abortion law. But just very briefly on Archie Battersby, because I would love to bring some of the other people in the audience into this conversation. I can see that Gray Andrews has his hand up. Anil, you have looked at human brains in different states and tried to unpick what we can reveal about the sort of inner universe of a person by measuring the brain from the outside. And there's a brilliant bit, I think, in one of your talks where you ask sort of, imagine what it's like to be a brain. You're encased in this very dark, isolated environment. You're not subject to any stimulus but the electrical stimulus that comes in and out through the senses. And I wonder if you could just explain to us a little bit what you've kind of learned about brains in different states, or in states of damage, in states of rest, unrest, dreaming, etc. What do we really know about how the brain state can differ?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it very, very short so that we can take some questions. But yeah, I mean, there's broadly three ways that I try to think about consciousness that structure the book as well. One is conscious level. So this is this difference between being awake and aware, as we all are now. Cases like coma, the vegetative state, which are called disorders of consciousness, that Archie Battersby was diagnosed as being in the coma, and then in the vegetative state. And there's also sleep, there's anesthesia, there's dreaming, there's the psychedelic state. There are kind of global states of consciousness, which determine both, are we conscious at all, and is there some sort of global characteristic to how our consciousness appears, because dreaming and psychedelics are different from normal waking consciousness.
Yeah.
So we can look at what happens in the brain that is indicative of being in one or other of these different states. Separate from that, and we won't talk about that right now, is what's happening in the brain during perception. So when we are conscious, what determines what we're conscious of, both in the outside world and this consciousness of being a self, of being me or being you. That's where I talk about the brain as a prediction machine and things being controlled hallucinations. But just to return to Archie Battersby, this is indeed a tragic case, and it's one of the areas in which a basic understanding of the brain basis of consciousness is beginning to have ethical, legal, and clinical applications. So what happens, and I don't actually know what, as maybe somebody here does now, I don't know what happened to Archie that led him to be in the condition he is in. I don't know how his injury arose. I have not seen any of the medical data, but what typically will happen after a severe brain injury, and this can happen through lack of oxygen or through trauma, car crash or something. If it's severe, people will go into a coma, and in a coma, it's sort of unambiguously unconscious. You don't behave, not dead, you just lie there. You're not dead, heart is going maybe, but you're not engaging with the environment until your eyes are not open, and so on. But typically, people don't stay in coma very long unless they're kept there with general anesthesia, and they'll enter this really difficult state called the vegetative state, which is a state that's been often called wakefulness without awareness, or the unaware wakeful state. And this is really tricky because people in this state will go through sleep-wake cycles. They'll wake up, their eyes will open, they might look around, they might occasionally appear to interact with their environment, they might raise a hand. But the idea is there's no consciousness, there's no awareness underneath this. And when people are in that state, it's very difficult to know what to do, and especially to be able to predict whether they're going to come out of that state ever. And colleagues of mine over the years, not me, but colleagues of mine, have developed really useful ways of predicting whether people are going to come out of vegetative state based on their brain activity. Basically, you can do things like inject a pulse of energy and see how far it reverberates around the brain. The more is better. It doesn't mean they're conscious in the here and now necessarily, but it means they might be more likely to recover.
Yeah.
But if someone is brainstem dead, and the case of Archie Battersby is about not just the cortical parts of the brain, but the brainstem really deep in, if that is sufficiently damaged, then there basically is no prospect of recovery. And I think that's what the judge decided on the balance of probabilities was the case with Archie.
Yeah, so I think Brian Farmer is still on the call, has joined us. You've been covering Archie's story, and I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the wider context and the decisions that are essentially at play between Archie's parents, overseeing doctors, and what you've sort of learned in looking at that.
So in terms of what happened to him?
Well, yeah, maybe that's a place to start.
Raises an interesting reporting question. So he was found suspended by his mother's bathrobe cord from a stair banister. It seemed that he'd fallen, plunged, whatever the word, from a stair banister, and he'd landed on his feet, but his body at an angle. And they seemed to think that he was without oxygen for about 40 minutes, although there's some dispute about that. So the evidence from an early stage, there have been High Court hearings now for about 6 weeks. The doctors have said all along that all the tests show that they believe that he's brainstem dead. However, he's connected to a ventilator and his heart is still beating. So his parents disagree that he's dead because they say his heart is beating and that he might recover, there might be a miracle. What the High Court judge was asked to decide, I can't remember now, 2 weeks ago, was two questions. On the balance of probabilities, was Archie brainstem dead? And if the answer to that was no, is it in his best interest to continue life support treatment? She concluded that on the balance of probabilities, he was brainstem dead. And she said that had she been asked to answer the second question about continuation of treatment, she would have said it wasn't in his best interest. What's the interesting case in my experience, it is different about this case, is that I must have covered maybe half a dozen cases where hospitals, doctors have asked judges to make a declaration of death. A situation where you get someone who doctors say has died, but parents won't accept the decision or relatives accept the decision. But in every case that I can recall, there has always been a brainstem test, and the accepted test of death legally, the test that judges accept. In fact, I've posted the judgment, the judge explains it in detail, is the brainstem test. If your brainstem isn't functioning, your brainstem is dead, then you are dead. The problem with Archie Battersby's case is they haven't been able to carry out a brainstem test. First of all, his parents didn't want them to carry out a brainstem test. So the judge had to make an order saying they could. But when they tried, this is getting way beyond my levels of understanding, but the initial test they carry out as part of a brainstem test is a peripheral nerve stimulation test. And he wasn't responding to that. And that, from the evidence, was almost unique, that he wasn't responding. So they said, if he isn't responding to that, then we can't carry out the brainstem test. And the evidence of a neurologist at the trial was that MRI scans showed that his brain was decaying, that necrosis had set in, and that it's too horrific to talk about, really, but that matter from his brain was falling towards the back of his neck, and it had damaged the spinal cord where the connection is to the brainstem, and why the peripheral nerve stem test.
And can I ask you, Brian? So in this case, Archie's parents play a pretty considerable role in shaping how the tests that he's subjected to unfold, and indeed, as you mentioned there, what actually the final decisions made are. Is that correct? His parents are sort of in the driving seat.
Yeah, it's a standard kind of life support treatment dispute, really, and the law says that where doctors and relatives, parents don't agree, then a High Court judge in the family division of the High Court makes a decision. It's no different to that, to Charlie Gard, Alfie Evans, Isaiah Hastrup. It's no different in that sense. And so the other thing I was just going to say, just to carry on the story, is that Archie's case is now going to the Court of Appeal. It's going to the Court of Appeal on one issue, and that's to do with the test that the judge applies. So the normal rule in a criminal court is that you have to be, it's beyond reasonable doubt. The jury has to be sure beyond reasonable doubt. The normal test in civil courts is done on the balance of probabilities. What Archie's parents say is that a judge shouldn't decide that their child is dead, brainstem dead, on the balance of probability. She should be sure.
Right.
So it's going to the Court of Appeal because that question's never been considered by the Court of Appeal before. Strikes me as a question a lot of parents probably agree with, that if you're going to declare someone dead, you possibly ought to be sure. So that's the only point it's going to the Court of Appeal on. There isn't a date for an appeal hearing, but it's due next week. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's something that we at Tortoise should certainly be paying attention to. I'd love to turn to Morgan Mitchell in a moment, who's put a number of interesting ideas and questions in the chat. But just very briefly on that subject, Anil, heartbeat and response to peripheral stimulus, etc., that doesn't really go to the heart of whether someone's still having a conscious experience, does it?
No, that depends on the brain, and you know, as Brian just said, the legal definition of death has moved from breath to heart to brain over the years, and it is, if your brain is doing the right thing, you will have conscious experiences. If it's not, or not capable of, then you won't. And the fact that he had an anoxic injury, lack of oxygen, is not good. I mean, that usually means the damage is less recoverable. And just looking briefly at that judgment, indeed, you know, it does seem to suggest the brainstem is very, very badly damaged and deteriorated. And that means, like, he's basically, I would say, there's definitely balance of probabilities that he's brainstem dead. Quite where you make that beyond reasonable doubt is hard to know how that line gets drawn.
Thank you, Anil. So Morgan, if you're there, it'd be great for you to let us know what you've been thinking and some of the questions you have.
Yeah, I mean, I probably won't do my questions any justice now that I'm going to say them out loud, but I was just going back to thinking about this idea that human children, perhaps before the age of 18 years of age, 18 months old, don't kind of recognize themselves in a mirror test, and whether that's not just a case of them not being conscious or having some kind of perception of their own inner world. It's just one that we can't access or measure. And then thinking about picking up on the point that Anil had made about sort of pain perception in children also, and how we kind of U-turned on that. And from what I understand, the research behind that was more on was in animal models, and based on how the sort of neural circuitry for pain is laid out in those developmental stages really early on in sort of embryonic life. And whether actually we're just looking at sort of the wrong, I don't know the correct way of saying that, but the wrong sort of neuroscientific methods to sort of measure or quantify some kind of consciousness. Like MRI scanning, for example, is a very here and now snapshot of what's going on. But perhaps looking to more sort of developmental research, how the brain's conceived or how it's laid out, is actually more to the answer of how it then can recognize its own self, if that makes sense. I imagine the answers for that would be in the actual circuitry, rather than sort of this melee of different things that are going on that we now quantify as consciousness.
It's a superb question. I think maybe we could put it in the terms of sort of, Anil, are we smart and conscious enough to know how smart and conscious other things are?
I don't think we are, frankly. I think we often, because we're so biased by anthropocentrism, anthropomorphism being like, we think we're super special and important, anthropomorphism being that we tend to see other things through the filter of what it's like to be us, which I think makes us less likely to attribute consciousness to things that are dissimilar from us that might be conscious, and perhaps more likely to attribute consciousness to things that bear some superficial similarity to us in some limited dimensions, but are not conscious. And just to Grace's point, I think it's very, sorry, not Grace, Morgan. I don't know where Grace came from. Morgan's point, that I don't think there's any single ideal way of measuring something like this, but typically the way things might go is you start with something that is behavioral, and then you really want to understand what the underlying mechanisms are, because that might be more certain. But then you also face the problem that sometimes it's much less easy to measure or to observe these underlying neural mechanisms than it is to observe behavior. So you're always, it's not that one is better. Ideally, you end up combining lots of different indicators to make a judgment. So in a case, again, of brain injured patients, you might combine behavioral with imaging methods of different sorts. And also, some developmental knowledge can come in there as well about developmentally, which brain regions do we think are most important for being aware.
And so I'd love also to bring in Julie Bush and potentially, if she's there, Katerina. But there was a phrase you used just now, Anil, superficial similarities between us and other things. And that to me was really the crux of what happened with LaMDA, right? We saw in the slide and in the transcript of the conversation that this model was able to give a superficial similarity to conversing with another human on all of this quite sort of deep subject matter, on the nature of existence, on what it means to live and die, what it means to have ambitions, all of the kind of key tenets of the stuff that you talk about in being you, right? Having this inner universe. Mm-hmm. The model was able to do it. And I wonder, how do you see the response to LaMDA? And do you think we're moving into a phase where we're going to have to answer more of those questions rather than less?
I think they're going to keep coming up. I mean, they've been coming up for a while, right? And it's 10 years ago, or like 8 years ago, there was this chatbot called Eugene Goostman, which caused a similar furore. But I think the LaMDA debate is both totally dull and unimportant, but also interesting because of the furore it's raised and the sort of feeding frenzy around it. So the AI community, which I'm partly in, is usually at loggerheads with itself about this or that, but it's almost entirely unified in the opinion that this is nonsense. There's absolutely no reason to believe that LaMDA, which is conscious or sentient, and many reasons to believe it is not. Just to explain, LaMDA is this, what they call a large language model. It's able to have conversations with people, and it's kind of interesting the conversations it can come up with.
Yeah.
One AI researcher, I think, very cleverly renamed it a word sequence model, because it doesn't actually have language in the same way that you or I do. What it's able to do is, because it's been trained on probably like most of the text that's ever been written ever, it's able to predict what good set of words might come next, given some input. And it just predicts the next word. It just maps from its input to its output. And the fact that there's no understanding there is easily revealed by some of the dialogue. So there was a question, I think, to LaMDA about what makes you happy. And I think LaMDA replied, friends and family, spending time with friends and family, which is total bullshit, of course, because it doesn't have any friends or family. And so it doesn't know what it's saying, doesn't know anything about anything. And this is very clear. What's interesting is how some people, and Blake Lemoine, I mean, there's a kind of, I think, messiah complex among many Google engineers that, they want to see something amazing in their own creations. Like, they want to see themselves at this pivotal point in technological development where we usher in our machine gods or something like that. But it's not just the engineer. I mean, it's many other people as well. And I think culturally, we do have this tendency to project sentience into artifacts. I mean, this goes back to the Torah in Judaism, and goes back as far as you like. Frankly, there's all sorts of things. Ex Machina being, I think, the greatest film about this by Alex Garland. But the fatal flaw here again is we're conflating signs of intelligence with signs of consciousness. Now, LaMDA is neither. LaMDA is not intelligent in the way that we are. It doesn't understand what it's doing. It's just a very, very sophisticated pattern predictor. But even if it were, that wouldn't necessarily mean that we should infer that it feels anything.
Yeah.
This distinction again between intelligence and consciousness, and because of our human exceptionalism, we tend to bring the two things together. What we are going to be faced with is systems that are increasingly good at exploiting our implicit human exceptionalism and give us the impression that there's something going on behind a screen. When there isn't. And and we have deep fakes now as well. So we have language models or word sequence models, and we have these deep fakes which can generate convincing animations of people's faces, whether they're real or not. You put those together, and I think it is a very dangerous concoction of living in a world where it does become hard at first glance to know if something is real and feeling something or is not. And I think that might distort our ethical compass and moral compass quite substantially. Exactly how that's going to happen. I think that concern is much more relevant and worth talking about than debates about whether we're actually on the verge of building a conscious machine, which I don't think we are.
Well, so there are certainly some things around us that we really don't struggle to, as you've just said, infer feeling and awareness into. And those are the other animals that we share this planet with. And we touched on it a little bit at the beginning, but I wondered if I could bring in Katerina, because you've been very close to a lot of work on animal rights, animal sentience, and the way, I guess, that we look at the other animals around us and how we ought to treat them. And what have you made of the conversation thus far?
I mean, a lot of the themes, I've been especially interested in killer whales, which are actually like large dolphins, although they're called whales. And a lot of these questions kind of concern them, because they're like, there's the issue of the like what kind of capacities can we like think that they have, and then what does this ethically imply? Like, for instance, they're kept in captivity at the moment, and then there's also like implications for wild killer whales. Like for instance, they use very sophisticated vocalization methods, and I'm interested in whether, like, it kind of raises the question whether we should be actually also trying to protect their possibilities of like using those vocalizations in the oceans, because right now, I mean, it's like oceans are full of noise pollution and all kinds of pollution. So
and your view as a consequence is that essentially, like, we don't yet really understand how similar or unsimilar killer whales and other animals are to humans, and until we understand that better, you think we're sort of overstepping the boundaries of invading their habitats, subjecting them to specific types of treatment, whether in the case of killer whales, obviously confinement, in the case of Happy the elephant also, but I guess in the broader kind of food production industry, what do you think is, what's your sort of agenda for change, I suppose, looking to the next few years?
Well, I guess my agenda would be, there's been this debate about whether Happy should be a legal person. And there's also been a debate about where there was this law case on Tillicum, who was in SeaWorld. And I think that animal's dead now, but like there was a debate about whether that animal should have personhood. And it turned out it wasn't granted, obviously, but that's maybe something that could be an interesting and something that I'm also interested in, and is like maybe helping people, or it would be interesting if we would better understand how important culture is for wild animals, for example, like why maybe we should be preserving even wild animal cultures in the wild, like, does it have any ethical significance, or yeah?
Yeah, because I mean, one thing that we certainly took away at Tortoise from the story of Happy the elephant is that this isn't the last time. It felt like kind of one of the more substantive first times that we're going to have this debate as a society, but it certainly won't be the last. And I'm definitely very interested in learning more about the types of cultures that animals have amongst themselves, non-human animals have amongst themselves. There was something that you'd spoken about a little bit, Anil, or at least referenced on Twitter, the Corvid Cognition, Bird Cognition Laboratory in Cambridge, that was working and had been for decades on understanding culture, deception, behavioral habits, tricks, thought, complex thought amongst birds, that's now at risk of losing its funding and ending up unable to do that work. Mm-hmm. Just quickly, because I'd love to bring Gray Andrews in. He's had his hand up for a while, and also Julie Bush. But Anil, there's a part of the book where you talk about mental time travel, and this concept that conscious things can often situate themselves in the past, mm-hmm. and in the present, and they can sort of project themselves into the future, imaginative versions of themselves into the future. And when I was reading that, some of the studies on the crows and their ability to play tricks and hide food, and I was like, that's mental time travel. Yeah. That's the ability to situate yourself. And what do you think is the significance of mental time travel, and how do we, what should we be looking for to test it, I suppose?
I mean, I think its significance is a little bit like the significance of the mirror test. It's extremely interesting, and it shows that animals that have capability, are similar to us in this quite significant way. They can remember specific episodes in the past and project themselves in specific ways into the future. I don't think that is a necessary condition for being conscious. Like, we shouldn't say that only animals that have the capability for mental time travel qualify as being conscious or have ethical standing. That's not true at all. But it does mean that they perhaps can have the potential to suffer in other ways, potentially by imagining possible futures. Right. Thinking about human psychology, we can feel sad, but we can also feel disappointed because we expected something that didn't happen. And we can also feel regret because we can imagine counterfactual futures. And these just amplify the different ways in which we can suffer. And if an animal has this competence, then I think we need to be mindful of that competence when figuring out what environment is suitable. And the lab in Cambridge is it's pretty unique. It's run by Nikki Clayton, and it's been running for many years. Corvids, crows, scrub jays, that they live long lives, and they take a long time to develop. You can't just sort of close this lab and open it up the next year. And it's that kind of continuity that's really important. It's probably the leading Corvid lab in the world, so it'd be a huge shame. And I know there's a strong effort. I've been sort of supportive of it to try and keep the lab open, and I'm slightly optimistic that I think it will stay open.
Yeah, well, we'll keep an eye on that also, certainly. Gray Andrews, thank you so much for being so patient. I can see you've just put something in chat, but it'd be great to hear from you.
Hello. This is more for Anil, really. Do animals have things in the temporal lobe like fusiform gyrus, where it can actually recognize its own face, or in the what the hell's the word now? It's in the interior part of the lobe where there are fragments of faces, and the gyrus actually generates the faces from the bits and specialized cells within the brain. I mean, there's a difference between consciousness and being self-aware.
Yeah.
Having an identity. I read a book by Doug Hofstadter about this. I Am a Strange Loop, which seems quite compelling. Some of the stuff that Oliver Sacks has done, Ramachandran has done. Well, I think something I read a while ago. He said our brains are completely wired up, and they get trimmed between now and when the adult brain is actually formed. So a lot of the wiring, we're talking about synesthesia and things like this, a lot of the wiring gets crossed up during its development. I think somewhere else, I think it was Bob Sapolsky, the human cortex doesn't fully form until we're 25 years of age or something.
If ever.
Yeah, I don't know, if ever. Yeah, looking at the world, please, I want to go back and grow rice again. It's a simpler life than being in the West. But yeah, no, completely right. I just really, it's a couple of things. Do animals have these structures within the brains to perform abstract thought, to recognize their own faces?
Is that something we could begin to understand, do you think, Anil?
Yeah, so I mean, just on this very specific, I mean, it's a very, very important question, and I don't think enough is known about the detailed structure of many animals' brains. I mean, the sort of the thing that happens in neuroscience is that quite a lot is known about a few animals, which is studied intensively, and then not very much about the vast majority. So certainly monkeys, other primates, have parts of their brain that are analogous to the fusiform face area in humans, and monkeys can recognize individual monkey faces. This is true. Quite how far that extends outside of primates, I honestly don't know, but I would imagine, I mean, faces seem to be, it's going to depend on, like, if animals are social, you can infer a lot from behavioral context, right? If animals are social animals where in recognizing the individual is important, like in social hierarchies and things like that, then it's going to be quite likely that their brains will have some way of recognizing individuals, whether through their face or something else. Like, do octopuses do this? I actually doubt it, because A, they're not that social, and B, maybe if they had anything, it would be like arm recognition area rather than face recognition area. So it's a bit hard to make that inference more widely. Yeah, so I think, I can't remember if there's another part of that question that you had.
No, great. Do you want to unmute yourself? Great, if there was anything to follow up.
Oh yeah, okay. It was I think with the octopuses are part of their physiology, or part of the nervous system, part of their brain is actually in their tentacles, funny enough. No, I meant from that base. Yeah, basically all of I mean, Bentham and sentience. Animals have the capacity to suffer. I can have a better conversation with a 1-year-old horse than I can with a 1-year-old human being. You know, and that sort of made a lot of sense to me when I did a philosophy degree about 20 years ago. I mean, go on.
I was just going to say, great. There are a couple of other people who put their comments and stuff in the chat, but thank you so much for that comment. If we could possibly get John, apologies, there's no last name there. It'd be great to hear from you. But there was something that I wanted to touch on, Anil, before we sort of wrap up, which is when you finished being you, and you looked around and thought, right, where do I go next? It appears you've sort of answered that question with a few different projects that I'd love to hear a bit more about. The Dream Machine and some of your work around the sort of hallucinating brain. Because when I, as a journalist, looked around and thought, where are the real exciting areas in consciousness studies to start kind of piecing together this conversation, those were two of the biggest things that came up. So would you mind telling us a bit about what the Dream Machine is? Sure,
yeah. I mean, I'm doing a whole bunch of stuff now, still along the same lines as is in the book, trying to advance that research agenda. But another project I've been involved with, I just put the link in the chat, for the last couple of years, is called the Dream Machine, and it's based on, like, I think it's quite a unique art science project, and it's based on a phenomenon called stroboscopically induced visual hallucinations. I know we've been focusing a lot on vision, and this is a bit more of that, I'm afraid, but back in the beginning of neuroscience, really 100 years ago, it was already known that fast flickering light, stroboscopic light on closed eyes, for most people will give very vivid visual experiences, colors and shapes and movement and all sorts of things that are not there in the light itself. And neuroscientists, including my group, have for a while been trying to figure out what's going on. Why does this happen? How does it happen? But it's also been an art project, Brian Geisen, an artist in the 1950s, invented the first dream machine, which was just like a bright light in a rotating cardboard tube with slits in. And people had amazing experiences, very deep emotional experiences, as well as visual experiences. And he was sort of mates with William Burroughs, and they tried to get it to the masses. It never really worked. And that's what we're trying to do now. So we got funding to bring this at a large scale to the public, where we've had about 13,000 people through now. It's all free, and it's 30 people at a time go through this experience. And for many of them, it's incredibly emotionally profound. It's incredibly moving. They have experiences they were not expecting to have in the half-hour journey through this dream machine, which has also spatial sound by John Hopkins and all these things. And it's in London, and it's until July 24. We're also opening soon in Belfast. We just closed in Cardiff, and then we'll open in Edinburgh a little bit later in the summer as well. And the other thing that's related to that is this idea, and this is, I think, very closely related to what we've been talking about with animals, that even within human beings, animals experience their worlds radically differently. There's a beautiful new book by Ed Yong coming out about this. I highly recommend. But we humans also experience the world differently, even though maybe not as differently as an octopus. The blue that I see when I look at a blue sky might not be the blue that you see. And Gray mentioned things like synesthesia, where people do have quite different experiences. They see colors that other people don't. But we don't know very much about our inner diversity. We focus a lot lately about how we differ on the outside, skin color, gender, and so on. But how do we differ on the inside? And so we have a project called the Perception Census, which is launching next month, which is trying for the first time to measure this perceptual diversity, get a handle on it, figure out how we're all different on the inside too, in a way that I hope is enriching for us rather than reductive.
Yeah. And so I guess there are two things from that. The first is, what to you would be the most kind of important findings? What are you really hoping to get at through those two projects that you described, and how might they kind of move on our understanding of some of the stuff we've been talking about? And the other is, how do you, I guess, personally decide what to look at and what to not? There's a huge opportunity cost, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the hard thing. Like, I didn't know I would be doing the Dream Machine 2 years ago, and when I started working on it with with a team, I had no idea it was going to become this consuming in my life over the last 2 years. So I guess life is like that, right? We partly have a plan, but then stuff happens. And as to what we want to find out, well, the Dream Machine itself is more about giving people a wonderful experience. I'm very interested in what the diversity of people's experiences are. People have different experiences in the Dream Machine, and what may explain that. And then for this larger perception census, it really is, there's just a very basic question which has emerged in the course of thinking about this, which is, we're familiar with sort of relatively striking differences in how we perceive things. We call synesthesia, we know about autism, and so on. But we know almost nothing about this sort of general diversity, general differences in how we experience things. I mean, there's another example, that photo of the dress that was blue or black or gold or white. Suddenly people couldn't believe that they were seeing the same thing differently. Now, that the thought is that this is going on all the time everywhere, but it's just not so dramatic. So we use the same words, so we don't realize we're having different experiences. And I want to know much more about the nature of our inner diversity. And I think that's going to have actually quite a lot of societal implications, because the more we can recognize that the way we see things is not necessarily the way they are, or the way that others see things. And this is a central theme in my book, that the way we see things is not the way they are. It's always a construction. Our brain brings its own biases to everything that we experience. Different brains are going to do that differently. And I think that's a powerful realization to allow us to build better bridges of understanding and empathy with each other.
Yeah. Well, so it's great that you sort of ended on that note, because when I was looking at sort of where the word consciousness comes from, the etymology is around not just a sense of being aware, but also a sense of being aware of wrongdoing. It had this kind of moralistic implication. And I can't help but think, sort of looking at the three stories that we started with at the top, that there is something about unlocking a greater sense of empathy, a greater sense of how to do right through a better understanding of consciousness, and sort of not just seeing all humans as this one homogenous form of thinking, but actually respecting that diversity. Do you know when we'll start to be able to see some of the findings and information coming out of what you've just described?
By the end of the year, hopefully late autumn, early winter, but certainly this year. And I totally agree. I think a deeper understanding of consciousness does help in all these areas, and that is indeed the root. Conscience is one of the roots of consciousness, having a conscience.
So Katerina's just put in a brilliant question that I think draws a lot of what we've been talking about together, which is how are we going to communicate greater understanding about consciousness, whether that's with animals or in the future with these programs as they become increasingly sophisticated and have that back and forth, some of which or a taste of which we maybe saw with LaMDA. Anil, very briefly before we finish, how can we communicate? How can we communicate with other species about consciousness?
Well, about anything. I think the question is how do we, we don't necessarily, our first conversation with killer whales doesn't have to be about the philosophy of mind, right? It could be about something else. Do you like all these big ships, or are they really pissing you off? Would be a more a better question to ask. Yes, the film Arrival is absolutely brilliant for this. The answer, I don't know the answer, of course, but there are some fascinating developments here. There's this thing called Project Doolittle. I don't know how many people have heard of it. I think that's its name. It should be its name, even if it isn't. Where people are building AI model, a little bit like, well, not quite like LaMDA, but again, just classification, machine learning models. Machine learning now is just very good at identifying, extracting patterns from data. That's what it's good at. It's not really good at that much else. So the idea is, can you just train a machine learning model to start to classify, interpret animal language by feeding it lots of examples and figuring out what the patterns are? And it's not like a direct translation like Google Translate, but it's an approach to trying to figure out what underlying structure there might be to the whale songs, to the whoops of vervet monkeys, and so on. And I was just amazed by a friend of mine has an RSPB app, Raw Sighted Collection of Birds app on his phone, which just sort of detects bird song and then regurgitates it back out. And you can hear the birds responding to this, which is just like, it's kind of a scary thing. There's no communication happening here at all. But there's some sort of connection. And I think the reference to Arrival is absolutely right, because we need to be so cognizant that the assumptions we make in what is entailed by communication just may not be met by non-human species.
It's absolutely fascinating. I can't help but think of a world in which, we'll develop a way to ask Happy the elephant how it feels in the zoo. But unfortunately, we've run to the end of the time, and I'm definitely left thinking that, there was a phrase you used, Anil, distortion to our ethical compass that can come from claims about sentience, claims about consciousness. And I suppose that will cut both ways when we think about the sort of the non-human animals and the machines that we've discussed. Learning to communicate about consciousness more clearly and to disentangle it from the kind of raw intelligence that, as you said, it tends to be very entangled up with, seems really important. I've obviously got in my notes to follow Archie's story, to follow Happy's story, and also to look at Project Doolittle, which sounds absolutely fascinating. I think this idea that, that there might be superficial similarity between us and other things when it comes to what it is to have an inner universe or to be aware and to be conscious is really what we've got to pay attention to, because those three stories really pointed me, I think, to this idea that consciousness is going to be more contested in the years to come than perhaps it has done in the past, with the emergence of sophisticated AI and with the rights of the animals that we share this planet with coming to the fore. It's just left to me to say thank you so much, Anil, for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure. I hope we can all go away with things to explore. That is, at least in part, what I intended when I said we were going to make sense of consciousness this evening. Thank you, everybody in the audience, for joining in, and to Phoebe for the brilliant slides and for all the links, etc., in the chat. I hope some of us can go out and enjoy what's left of the evening. Thank you very much, and we'll hopefully see you soon.